Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling the anti-science movement. And wow, is there a lot to unpack. You sent over this source, the anti-science movement throughout history, and it's got me thinking.
Oh, it's a fascinating read for sure.
Yeah, it really is. It's got me thinking, like, this isn't just about, flat earthers or something. It's about how scientific discoveries kind of shake things up, right? Like, how we see ourselves, even.
It really is. It challenges our beliefs, and sometimes those beliefs are tied up with, well, power structures.
Right. Like, who has the authority to say what's true? And that reminds me of this whole Galileo thing. Our source talks about how he butted heads with the church over his heliocentric model.
Yeah, the whole sun being the center of the solar system thing.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the science itself, was it?
Definitely not. I mean, the church's authority was basically built on the idea that Earth was the center of everything. So Galileo's findings, those were a direct threat to that power.
Makes sense. I mean, they labeled him a heretic, put him under house arrest.
Yeah, a pretty clear message to anyone else thinking of rocking the boat.
Wow. So it was about, like, silencing dissenting voices as much as upholding a particular worldview, huh?
In a way, yes. And it makes you wonder how often that's happened throughout history, How many discoveries have been stifled because they threaten the status quo?
Makes you think. Okay, so another thing that surprised me from the source was the resistance to the smallpox vaccine. Like, that was a huge deal. Life-saving, even. Why the pushback?
Well, think about it from their perspective. The idea of injecting yourself with cowpox to avoid smallpox. Back then, that must have sounded crazy. People were scared, right? Worried about side effects.
I guess that makes sense. The source even mentioned these cartoons they had.
What?
People sprouting cow parts after getting vaccinated.
Yeah. It shows you how powerful fear can be. Even when something's clearly beneficial, fear can totally overshadow that.
So fear of the unknown, lack of understanding, that's a recurring theme, it seems. Kind of like with the Luddites during the Industrial Revolution. Our source touches on them briefly.
Yeah. They weren't exactly anti-science, but smashing those machines, that speaks volumes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, their jobs were disappearing, their whole way of life.
It's that fear of progress, right? Even if it's ultimately for the best, that change can be really scary.
And it highlights how technology creates winners and losers. It's
Yeah.
like we're seeing that today with AI, right?
Uh-huh.
All this talk about jobs being replaced.
Exactly. The Luddites might have been smashing looms, but that same anxiety is still around today, just different targets.
Makes you think.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, the source also dives into this whole evolution versus religion debate. Seems like a classic case of science clashing with deeply held beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. The Scopes monkey trial, that's a prime example. Teaching evolution in school. For some, that challenged their entire worldview.
It's like science was forcing them to reconsider their understanding of, well, everything.
And that can be really unsettling for people. Makes them question their place in the universe, their purpose.
Right, right. And it seems like that tension hasn't really gone away, has it? I mean, even today.
Not at all. And what's interesting is our source talks about how these anti-science sentiments can be, well, manipulated.
Like how the tobacco industry downplayed the link between smoking and cancer.
Precisely. They hired their own experts, funded research that supported their claims, and ran these massive marketing campaigns to make smoking seem cool.
Wow, so they deliberately sowed doubt and confusion for their own profit, basically.
Exactly. And it worked for decades, delaying any real action on public health.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, how many times has that happened? Powerful groups twisting science for their own gain.
More than we'd like to think, probably. And it just underscores how important it is to be critical of information, especially when it comes from sources with a vested interest.
It's like you always got to ask, who benefits from this information? Speaking of vested interests, our source dives deep into climate change denial.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. It's not just about disagreeing with the data. There's a lot more going on there.
Right, because the source mentions things like fossil fuel companies actively funding campaigns to discredit climate science.
And they've been incredibly successful at it, too. They've created this whole ecosystem of doubt, using tactics straight out of the tobacco industry playbook.
Like profits over the planet, right? But then there's this whole psychological aspect, too, right? The source talks about that.
Yeah, because let's face it, accepting climate change means accepting that we need to make some big changes, and for some people, that's just too scary.
So easier to deny the problem than to face the solutions.
Unfortunately, yeah. And that denial is amplified by these echo chambers we see online, especially on social media.
Our source goes into that. It's like these algorithms, they feed you more of what you already believe in, whether it's true or not.
Precisely. They prioritize engagement over accuracy. So the more outrageous and sensationalized the content, the more likely it is to spread.
Yeah, I've definitely fallen down those rabbit holes myself. You click on one article and suddenly your whole feed is filled with, conspiracies and misinformation.
It's a real problem, and it makes it even harder to have these nuanced, fact-based conversations about important issues.
Like climate change.
Oh.
But the source does offer some hope, right? It talks about how scientists and public health officials are getting smarter about how they communicate.
Yeah, they're fighting back, so to speak. They're using new tools and strategies like storytelling and empathy to connect with people on a deeper level.
I've seen that, like those public health campaigns using humor and social media influencers. It's pretty clever.
They're meeting people where they are instead of just lecturing them. And with climate change, there's this shift from doom and gloom to hope and action.
So instead of just scaring people, they're empowering them to be part of the solution.
It's a more optimistic approach and hopefully a more effective one.
I hope so. But the source also reminds us that this anti-science stuff, it has real-world consequences, like serious consequences.
Oh, absolutely. The source cites the COVID-19 pandemic as a prime example. All that misinformation about masks and vaccines, it cost lives.
Yeah, it was a stark reminder that rejecting science can literally be deadly.
And it's not just a modern phenomenon either. The source mentions the cholera outbreaks in the 19th century. People were so distrustful of doctors and public health measures that they actually attacked health officials.
That's wild. And all because of fear and misinformation, right?
Exactly. It shows you how these anti-science sentiments can escalate to violence, even when people are just trying to help.
It's like we can't afford to ignore this stuff. It's not just some abstract debate. It has real-world impacts.
Right, and those impacts can be devastating. It's a reminder that we need to take this seriously, to understand it, and to find ways to counter it effectively.
Well, on that sobering note, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
Absolutely.
But there's still much more to explore. So picking up where we left off, one thing that really stood out to me from our source is this idea that the anti-science movement, it's not like, one big homogenous group.
It's more like a tapestry or something, lots of different threads woven together.
I like that, a tapestry, because you've got these economic anxieties, religious beliefs, and even just like plain old distrust of authority.
And it's all tangled up with, well, how science is presented sometimes. Like, you can't just throw facts at people and expect them to change their whole worldview.
Especially when those facts challenge their sense of identity, right? Like we talked about with evolution and religion. That's a big one.
Huge. Because it's not just about, oh, did humans evolve from apes or not? It's about, like, what does it mean to be human? Where do we fit in the grand scheme of things?
Existential stuff, for sure. And when science comes along and says, hey, maybe things aren't how you thought they were, well, that could be pretty unsettling.
For sure. It can make people feel like the rug's been pulled out from under them. And that's where I think communication is key. Like, how do we present scientific ideas in a way that's respectful of people's beliefs, even if those beliefs might be, based on something other than scientific evidence?
It's about finding that balance, right, between presenting the facts and acknowledging that those facts might not always fit neatly into people's existing worldview.
Exactly. And our source also talks about how important it is to acknowledge the uncertainties inherent in science.
Right, because sometimes it feels like science is presented as this set of absolute truths. And if one of those truths turns out to be wrong or incomplete, well, that can really damage people's trust.
It can feel like a betrayal almost. Like, hey, you told me this was the truth, and now you're changing your story.
And that's why it's important to emphasize that science is a process, right? It's constantly evolving, refining its understanding as new evidence emerges.
It's about being honest about the limitations of our current knowledge. Like, here's what we know so far, but we're still figuring things out. That kind of approach.
It's more humble, right? Less about claiming absolute certainty and more about acknowledging that we're all on this journey of discovery together.
And that humility, I think, can actually make science more appealing to people who are skeptical. It shows that scientists aren't these all-knowing figures, but rather, fellow humans who are just trying to make sense of the world.
It makes them more relatable. And speaking of making science relatable, the source talks about the power of storytelling. Like how using narratives and anecdotes can make these complex ideas more engaging and easier to understand.
Absolutely. Stories have this incredible ability to connect with us on an emotional level. Like, we might forget a statistic, but we'll remember a story.
It's like instead of just saying, climate change is real, here's the data, you tell a story about a family who had to relocate because of rising sea levels.
Right. Suddenly, it's not just an abstract concept. It's something real, something tangible, something that affects people's lives.
It makes it personal. And that brings us to another important point from the source: empathy. Like, even when we're dealing with people who hold views we might disagree with, it's important to try to understand where they're coming from.
Totally. Because if you just shut people down or dismiss their concerns, they're going to dig in their heels even harder.
It's about finding that common ground, that shared humanity, even when we have different perspectives.
And sometimes it's as simple as saying, hey, I understand why you might feel that way. Just acknowledging someone's feelings, even if you don't agree with them, can go a long way.
It's about creating a space for dialogue, right? Where people feel heard and respected, even if their views are different from our own.
Exactly. Because ultimately, we're all in this together. And that reminds me of something else the source talks about, this shift in how some scientists are talking about climate change.
Oh, yeah. Instead of focusing on the doom and gloom, the worst-case scenarios, they're highlighting solutions, focusing on the positive changes that are happening.
Because, I mean, let's be honest, constantly hearing about how the world is going to end, it can be paralyzing.
It can make people feel like, what's the point? It's too late to do anything anyway.
But if you can show people that there's hope, that we can still make a difference, that can be incredibly motivating.
It's about empowering people, giving them a sense of agency. Like, yes, there are challenges, but here's what we can do about it.
Exactly. And that's a much more effective way to get people on board with making those changes.
For sure. But, the source also reminds us that the anti-science movement, it's not just about delaying progress or spreading misinformation.
Yeah.
Sometimes it has real-world consequences, like serious harm.
Yeah, and that's scary. Like we saw it with the COVID-19 pandemic, all those conspiracy theories and misinformation about masks and vaccines. It literally cost people their lives.
It's a sobering reminder that rejecting scientific evidence can have devastating impacts, not just for individuals, but for entire communities and even the planet as a whole.
Absolutely. And it's not just a modern phenomenon either. The source talks about the cholera outbreaks in the 19th century where people were so afraid and distrustful of medical authorities that they actually attacked health officials.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these anti-science sentiments, they can be incredibly powerful and even dangerous when they're fueled by fear and misinformation.
For sure. And it underscores the importance of addressing misinformation promptly and effectively. It's not just about debunking false claims, but about understanding the underlying anxieties that drive people to believe them in the first place.
So it's a complex issue, right? It requires a multifaceted approach, addressing both the content of the misinformation and the emotional and social factors that contribute to its spread.
It's about recognizing that we're dealing with human beings, not just data points.
Yeah.
And that means understanding their fears, their hopes, and their values, even if those things might lead them to conclusions we disagree with.
This discussion has really opened my eyes to the complexities of the anti-science movement and the challenges of communicating science effectively. It seems like there's no easy solution, no one-size-fits-all approach.
I agree. It's an ongoing process that requires constant dialogue, adaptation, and a willingness to learn from both our successes and our failures.
And it's a process that we all have a role to play in, whether it's through staying informed, engaging in thoughtful conversations, or advocating for policies that promote scientific literacy and evidence-based decision-making.
Absolutely. It's a collective effort that requires a shared commitment to understanding the world around us and to using that understanding to create a better future for everyone.
Well said. This has been a truly thought-provoking conversation, and I hope our listeners have found it valuable as well. Picking up where we left off, one thing that strikes me is how this anti-science thing, it's not just like a bunch of theories. It has real-world consequences,
Oh, absolutely. And our source makes that very clear, doesn't it? It's not just about rejecting a few facts here and there.
Yeah.
It's about how those rejections, those anxieties can actually impact people's lives.
Right. And one way they do that, it seems, is by tapping into existing anxieties that are already out there, especially about economic stuff.
Makes sense, right? Like, think about the Luddites. Sure, on the surface, they were smashing machines, but underneath that, it was about their jobs, their livelihoods. They were scared,
Totally. Their whole world was changing, and not necessarily for the better, at least from their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like we see echoes of that even today, like with AI, right? All this talk about robots taking our jobs.
It's the same fear, just different packaging, I guess. It's like anytime there's a big technological shift, that fear of being left behind, it bubbles up.
And it's not just limited to technology either, right? Like our source talks about how climate change denial, often it's intertwined with these economic anxieties too.
For sure. Like, if your entire community relies on, say, coal mining, the idea of switching to renewables, it's not just about saving the planet, it's about your job, your family, your whole way of life.
It's like, how do you balance the urgency of climate change with the very real concerns of people whose livelihoods are tied to these industries?
It's tough. And it's something that, honestly, I don't think we've fully figured out yet, but it's something we need to figure out, and fast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's not just economic anxiety, right? The source talks about how psychological factors, things like confirmation bias, they play a role too.
No, confirmation bias is huge. It's that tendency we all have to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, even if it's not, actually true.
And in the age of social media, it's like that confirmation bias is on steroids,
But for real.
Yeah.
Algorithms, echo chambers, personalized news feeds, it's like we're all living in our own little information bubbles, surrounded by people who agree with us.
So how do we pop those bubbles? Like, how do we have productive conversations about science, especially with people who might be starting from a place of, skepticism or even outright denial?
Well, I think one key is to focus on relationships, on building trust. It's less about, winning an argument and more about finding that common ground, that shared humanity.
It's about starting from a place of understanding and respect, even if you disagree on the specifics.
Exactly. And another thing is to be honest about the limitations of science. Like, instead of presenting it as this set of absolute truths, acknowledge that it's a process, that we're still learning, that there's always more to discover.
It's about being comfortable with uncertainty.
Yay.
Right? Because science is all about embracing that unknown, about constantly questioning and testing and revising our understanding.
Right. And I think that approach, it can actually make science more appealing to people who might be skeptical. It makes it feel less like, dogma being handed down from on high and more like, a collaborative journey that we're all on together.
I like that, a collaborative journey. And speaking of journeys, another thing our source emphasizes is the importance of media literacy, especially in this digital age where misinformation can spread so easily.
Oh, media literacy is huge. It's about being able to critically evaluate the information we encounter, to recognize bias, to understand how algorithms and personalized content feeds can shape our online experience.
It's like we need to be savvy consumers of information, not just passively absorbing whatever pops up in our feeds.
Exactly. And that means being willing to question our own assumptions, to seek out diverse perspectives, to fact check before we share something.
It's a lot of work, but it's crucial work if we want to have these informed, nuanced conversations about science and its role in society.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately it comes down to recognizing that science at its core is about a pursuit of truth, a desire to understand the world around us. And that pursuit, it's something we can all be a part of, regardless of our background or beliefs.
Well, that's a pretty hopeful note to end on. And honestly, after diving deep into this whole anti-science movement, a little bit of hope is kind of what I needed.
Me too. Because even though there are challenges, there are also so many people out there who are passionate about science, about using it to make the world a better place.
And that's pretty inspiring. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked some curiosity, maybe even some healthy skepticism.
Because questioning, that's at the heart of science, isn't it?
It really is. So keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep exploring. This is The Deep Dive, signing off.